This video is brought to you by Digital Foundry and Asus, and it's a look at the generational changes within Nvidia's 70 class graphics cards, starting way back at 2018 with the launch of the DX12 Ultimate Equipped RTX 2070, leading up to today's RTX 5070. Think of this as a more focused retrospective look back at this specific and highly popular class of GPU, which may have relevance to those on older cards looking for their next upgrade. And the cards I'm looking at today. With one or two exceptions, I'll be using the Asus Tough Gaming line of products. To my mind, the Tough Gaming line represents a sweet spot of sorts. Massive coolers for lower temperatures, there's overclocking support of course, and dual BIOS functionality. So I'll be using the Tough Gaming 3070, 4070 and 5070 for this video, but not the 2070. There was no Tough 2070 back in the day, so I'm substituting in a Strix variant instead. Top of the line for its time. Now, as I understand it, GPU buyers tend to stick to the same class of card from one generation to the next, or stick to similar price brackets. In looking at 70 class specifically, not TI models or various offshoots, base MSRP pricing has been between $500 to $600, so it's a nice way to see how performance has increased over time in a market sector where pricing has been relatively stable. Looking over the 2070 to 5070 period, it's 7-8 years of base performance improvements, but I think that's just the beginning of the story. The nature of graphics rendering itself is evolving, and actually the nature of the displays we're connecting to our PCs has changed too. 70 class has typically been associated with 1440p gaming, but we've moved now into the era of affordable 1440p high refresh rate displays, culminating in the recently released G-Sync Pulsar, offering up to 360Hz refresh, but with custom technology that delivers a 4x motion clarity boost. I'd venture to suggest that 4070 and 5070 are much better equipped to deal with this class of display than their predecessors, and machine learning is playing a big part of that. But core performance is still important, of course. So let's kick off by pulling up some benchmarks from my original 5070 review. Today's tools give us a wealth of great data. Here's Cyberpunk 2077 native 1440p rendering in Psycho RT mode. Today's 5070 is over 3 times faster than the 2070. It offers a 68% performance uplift over the 3070, about 20% faster than the 4070. So with today's tools, we get power consumption metrics, clock speeds. You can see how core clocks dramatically improved once the technology moved to the 4nm process node. Plenty of great data, right? But this doesn't really demonstrate likely use case scenarios for the later generations of GPUs, or optimized settings for those earlier ones. But here we're looking at an average 40 FPS for the 4070, 48 FPS for the 5070. Okay, fair enough. But then here's a much more demanding area of Cyberpunk 2077 running with all path tracing features enabled and optimized rasterization settings. Base frame rate basically the same as those native benchmarks we looked at previously in a much heavier scene, thanks to DLSS super resolution and optimized settings tweaks, but frame generation and multi-frame generation shifts the experience into a better fit for today's high refresh rate displays. Benchmarks are great for standardized comparisons, right? But what about the way you're actually going to be using these GPUs? So while a review focuses on like-for-like testing to the point of not using brand new features in order to maintain parity, the games I'll focus on today will use those features, and we won't be using maxed out settings for the most part either, because optimized settings aim to claw back performance while still offering a fantastic visual experience. And while benchmarking in reviews can favour older games that have completed their optimization pushes, we're going to be focusing with one exception on what I've chosen some of the biggest or most important games of the last year. And we're going to kick off with Assassin's Creed Shadows, runner-up in our Best Game Graphics Awards of 2025, and a generational leap for Ubisoft's Anvil Next engine. The developers built their own version of Epic's Nanite microgeometry system for a huge detail upgrade, while lighting is transformed via ray-traced global illumination. and that's a literal game changer on this title. So optimized settings here will include ray tracing while balancing rasterization settings to get that right balance between fidelity and performance. We end up with a settings balance just slightly ahead of what the base consoles are doing in their 30 FPS quality modes, and we're using DLSS balance mode at 1440p, effectively upscaling from a base 835p rendering resolution. Typically, balance mode is absolutely fine for 1440p, but I'd say that the latest Transformer models make performance mode viable as well. Using the game's benchmark, the 2070 can dip beneath 30 FPS, but still delivers a 31.6 FPS average across the sequence. RTX 5070 takes you to a 77.8 FPS average across the same test, a nigh on 2.5x performance multiplier. Averaging at 48.5 FPS, I'd say the 3070 is holding up well for its vintage, with the 5070 around 61% faster. This puts the 5070 in a prime position, I'd say, for delivering a good multi-frame generation experience, but there is a slight problem. While the Transformer model DLSS does seem to be supported in AC shadows, only 2x frame gen is available in the options out of the box. No problem though, the Nvidia app can be used to override that, allowing for 4x MFG on 50 series cards. So in this visualization you can see how 4070 and 5070 compare with base frame rates along with 2x and 4x frame generation options. And as frame generation is tied closely to latency, we have the PC latency figures here too. They can vary somewhat in the moment, so let's swap over to averages across the bench. The 4070 is taking a base 70 FPS north of 100 FPS with a 114 frames per second average. 78 FPS on 5070 brings us to 220 frames per second. That's a new frame delivered on average every 4.5 milliseconds, which is quite remarkable. Latency figures don't shift much. The user has no control over Reflex in the settings here, there's no toggle, but with a 1 millisecond variance on 4070 and a 6 millisecond variance on 5070, the bottom line is that you're getting those generated frames with no perceptible impact to the feel of the game. So I do wonder whether Reflex is actually active when frame generation is turned off. Bit odd. So comparing 5070 back to 2070 and 3070, your likely upgrade paths, now you're looking at something very different. An already impressive pure performance boost changes when you look at how users will be tapping into new features should they so choose. The 5070 is effectively 7 times smoother than the 2070 with a 4.5x frame rate boost over the 3070. I don't consider this a quote-unquote benchmark in the traditional sense, to be clear, but what it is a totally viable comparison of use case scenarios, right? Of course, 2025 also included games that were specifically designed to run at high frame rates across a wealth of hardware, and I'd say that Battlefield 6 is probably the best example of this. It looks great, but visual advances are thin on the ground in terms of tapping into the latest rendering techniques. It's scalable then, but there are also very few visual returns by ramping everything up to the max. Prime territory for optimized settings. Our quote-unquote high optimized settings were the focus here, and there really is very little difference visually compared to ultra and overkill presets. The campaign intro is a great way to put the GPU through its paces, and here we find RTX 5070 offering another 2.5x performance multiplier over the RTX 2070 with a 50% boost over the 3070. Rounding up, frame rate averages are actually rather healthy. 60 FPS for 2070, 99 FPS for the 3070, 149 frames per second for the 5070. So I'd say optimized settings is delivering the goods here in balancing features with performance. But you can push further. With RTX 4070, 131 frames per second baseline takes you to 187 FPS with 2x frame gen, while the 5070's 149 FPS average rises to a remarkable 346 FPS with 4x MFG enabled. We're looking at a 10.2 milliseconds average increase in PC latency on the 4070, rising to 14.6 milliseconds on that fully unleashed 5070. Interestingly though, there's barely any difference in latency between 4070 at 2x frame gen up against 5070's 4x MFG. So, taking home a vast amount of Game of the Year awards, I had to take a quick look at Expedition 33 Clair Obscur and get some basic figures. Again, 1440p optimized settings, DLSS balance mode, and again, optimized settings doing a great job here of making an Unreal Engine 5 game that uses the big three UE5 features: nanite geometry, lumen global illumination, virtual shadow maps. Actually runs rather well. 49 FPS average in this sequence on 2070. That's 76 FPS on 3070, 113 frames per second on the 5070. A 2.32x multiplier for the 5070 against 2070, and a 49-point performance lead against 3070. All the figures here I'd say are excellent for the respective hardware they're running on, and you can't help but wish that all UE5 titles ran as smoothly as this one overall. But let's switch over to our 4070 and 5070 visualization, as effectively there's no latency difference on the 4070, whether it's at the 100 FPS baseline or the 2x frame gen 151 FPS average. Now, Reflex was enabled here, yet I do wonder whether it's active on the 4070 without frame gen running, or if there may be some other kind of latency bottleneck. Either way, in latency terms at least, FrameGen is effectively a free lunch on the 4070 in this test. 5070 though, the high 113 FPS baseline translates into an astonishingly low 20 milliseconds of PC latency, and even with 4x MFG we're at 288 FPS with latency rising by 11.8 milliseconds, with a final total that's again in line with 2x FrameGen latency on the 4070. So we've looked at what I'd describe as a well-optimized PC game in the form of Assassin's Creed Shadows, where we could enjoy the key visual features, including RTGI, at high frame rates on 70 class GPUs. We've now looked at games that with simple optimization tweaks can deliver high performance and low latency, with frame generation taking you well into high refresh rate display territory. But I wanted to push harder by looking into path tracing in a couple of games, kicking off with a title that beat AC Shadows to our Best Graphics of 2025 award, Doom: The Dark Ages. So, rightly or wrongly, there's the perception that agreeable performance with path tracing is an 80/90 class kind of thing, but actually the very nature of ray tracing and path tracing is that it scales rather well with resolution. DLSS at 4K output resolution is good for those 80/90 class GPUs, right? But my thinking was that at 1440p, well, that should be good for 70 class, specifically the RTX 5070. Doom: The Dark Ages gives us a rich benchmarking suite that tests basically a vast range of environmental types within the game. Settings: 1440p DLSS performance mode. Visual quality here is fine with the transformer ray reconstruction model. I'm on Ultra with all path tracing options on, so let's dig in. Put simply, this is a workload for 40 series and 50 series cards at these settings. The older Turing and Ampere architectures just choke. Now, you do get more VRAM with the 5070 here, 12 gigabytes versus 8 gigabytes on the others, but even pushing texture cache settings down to the minimum on the older cards made no real difference. Even on this less intense scene, 5070 is over 10 times faster than the 2070, with a 5.8x performance multiplier versus 3070. 6.5 FPS average on 2070 plays 12 FPS on 3070 versus, well, 68.8 FPS average on the 5070. The video streams move out of sync as the 2070 in particular is literally running in slow motion. The gap is even wider in this more challenging forest scene, and as worst case scenarios go, 50 FPS plus for path tracing on ultra settings, pretty good for 5070 I'd say. We're still in that fun zone for good results with frame generation, and here's how that looks as we return to a 4070, 5070 visualization. That first zone, a larger than average baseline boost for 5070 over 4070. We're at 91 FPS with 4070 with 2x frame gen, but 4x MFG on 5070 takes us to 218 frames per second. A circa 8 millisecond increase to latency on 4070 rises to 12 milliseconds on the 5070. But once again, the huge frame rate boost from the 5070's increase in generated frames still delivers pretty much the same latency as 4070 with 2x frame gen. So Doom: The Dark Ages represents the latest game where the developers have collaborated with Nvidia to bring path-traced visuals to gamers. But I thought I'd end my tests by going back to Cyberpunk 2077. The benchmark game for the generation, I'd say, and also the first to bring path trace lighting to a AAA title, something I never thought would be possible for a couple of generations yet. But the whole concept speaks not just about the evolution in graphics hardware, but also developers' understanding of how to fully exploit that hardware via new rendering techniques. Here I ran full path tracing via RT Overdrive, and while frame rates were generally fine on the 5070, kind of wanted a bit more. So I kept all the path tracing features as is, despite some really good mods out there that tweak ray bounce variables for big performance boosts. Instead, I tweaked the rasterization settings to match the ray tracing mode on the consoles. So in effect, I used CD Projekt Red's own choice of optimized settings for this one, then layered path tracing without compromise on top of that. It can still be heavy though. The black market scene in the Phantom Liberty shows performance at its heaviest, I'd say. Once again though, the older Turing and Ampere cards can't cope at this level. You'll need to drop resolution and use some of those path traced optimization mods. 5070 5x faster than 2070 with a 2.4x performance multiplier over the 3070. With frame generation, 44.5 FPS baseline on 4070 up against the 50 FPS of the 5070. That rises 77.3 FPS with 2x frame gen on the older card, 160.3 FPS average with 4x MFG on the 5070. Latency then, a 10.5 millisecond increase with 4070 rising to 15.1 milliseconds on the 5070. Though once again you'll note that the huge boost to generated frames from the 5070 is still delivering much the same latency as 2x frame gen on the 4070. Still very playable, I'd say, with further gains to frame rate and reductions to latency available if you swapped to DLSS performance mode, or if you looked into some of those path tracing mods. And of course, this is a particularly challenging scene. Elsewhere, Cyberpunk 2077 with path tracing features enabled runs much better with lower latency, especially outside of the Phantom Liberty expansion. So to be clear here, path tracing is computationally expensive, but it's not an experience that's locked out to 70 class graphics cards. You just need to pick your battles settings wise, and the tools are there not just to actually run those experiences, but to give you a much smoother presentation on today's high refresh rate displays. But we've talked a lot about latency there and the increase to latency when we use frame generation. So there's one final testing point I want to discuss before we move on to some conclusions. Now, frame generation has three testing criteria really. There's the increase in frame rate, of course. There's the image quality of interpolated frames, and then there's the latency increase for using it. And it's the latter point I want to address because I'm really not sure Nvidia Reflex is getting the full credit it deserves. All testing up until now focuses on frame generation off versus on with Reflex enabled. But what about Reflex off? Now this is where things get interesting because Nvidia's anti-lag technology has by far the most take-up compared to AMD and Intel equivalents, by far the most. The driver level anti-lag isn't as effective, and as the option is so buried within the control panels, I bet most gamers don't use it anyway. So Reflex off testing, well, it puts things into perspective somewhat. Let's start with the most startling result. Cyberpunk 2077, full path tracing here enabled, but with optimized rasterization settings I used earlier. Performance and PC latency tracked in real time in this static scene. Reflex on and off both yield a 54 FPS average, but without Reflex we're getting an average 82 millisecond PC latency result, which is very, very, very high. Reflex takes that right down to 39 milliseconds, but the point is that we can run 4x multi-frame generation at 55 milliseconds, which is still way more responsive than running without frame generation with Reflex off. And remember, a lot of players out there will be playing Cyberpunk 2077 without Reflex being available to them. And in other games where Reflex isn't automatically on, they may not be turning it on. Different games have different levels of latency, right? Even running at the same frame rate, you might be interested to discover. Let's look now at Doom the Dark Ages. Again, whether you use Reflex on or off, performance is the same. you don't lose any frame rate by turning Reflex on. But without Reflex, PC latency, 54 milliseconds up against 32 milliseconds with Reflex on. That's a big saving. 4x MFG gives a 42.5 millisecond result, so response is still faster when running with Reflex off and frame generation off. Game latency can be tied to how complicated the rendering pipeline is, so my thought here was that path tracing might be quote-unquote laggier than standard rendering, so I went back to take a look at Expedition 33 Clair Obscur. Again, whatever advantages Reflex offers, there are no performance drawbacks in using it. In this scene we're at 116 frames per second average pre-frame generation. Without Reflex, a 35.7 millisecond latency up against 18.6 milliseconds with Reflex on. Again, that's a huge saving for an option that does not impact your performance. And what that means by extension is that the average 28.2 millisecond latency with 4x multi-frame gen active is again faster if you're running without frame generation and Reflex is turned off. Something to think about, but just generally I think there's plenty to look into with regards to latency. How it's perceived by different people, how it varies from game to game when they're running at the same frame rate, and how relative it is across various gaming scenarios, different GPUs, etc. Okay then, let me try to wrap up this video with some final thoughts. If the concept of graphics cards owners upgrading to GPUs of the same class, or for graphics cards that cost a similar amount of money, well, if that theory holds true, RTX 5070 actually fits the bill. It's a really good upgrade option. Compared to the RTX 2070, you're at an entirely different level of baseline performance, even before you factor in frame generation. Against the 3070, a 50 to 60% increase in raw like-for-like results is still a worthwhile upgrade. The gap between 4070 and 5070 is smaller in terms of standard rendered frames, indicative of a broader trend where generational leaps are getting more and more difficult. But at the same time, I don't think people generally upgrade from generation to generation anymore. The expected lifespan of a GPU is longer now. Even so, in looking at 4070 and 5070, the trend going forward is clear. The use of machine learning will continue to be used in concert with traditional rendering to change the way we experience games. And yeah, with that in mind, looking back at 2070 and 3070, high-end rendering like path tracing, far more achievable on more modern hardware. So, in putting this video together, I went back to my RTX 2070 review from 2018, and it's fascinating how the perspective on that GPU has just totally changed over time. Back in the day, you kind of got better than 1080 level performance for broadly comparable money. But DLSS was in its first iteration. It was an unproven technology. Ray tracing support, thin on the ground. Competitors weren't interested in producing graphics cards with ray tracing features or machine learning. Now, back in the day, there was every reason to consider the value of the product. But for Nvidia, I'd say that machine learning and ray tracing have been gambles that have paid off, where the likes of Intel and AMD are now investing heavily to catch up in those areas. Here in 2026, the advantages of those technologies are now established. It's less of a risk now. Comparing a 2070 to a 1080 makes no sense in the present day, where one can run games the other cannot, and where DLSS has proven to be so transformative. But perhaps, it is time to move on from those older generation RTX cards, if you have the funds available. So for me, the question now is not whether there's any kind of gamble on RT or ML technologies, but rather just how much of a difference they'll make over the next few years. Dynamic frame generation, for example, looks to me like the first step towards an end game where users simply dial in an output frame rate for their games and let machine learning do the heavy lifting. It also says to me that while we will still probably need to wait a while for the next generation of graphics hardware, the fact is that the capabilities of the hardware we already have may well change quite significantly, up to and beyond the launch of the presumed RTX 60 series line, simply down to advances in ray tracing optimization and, of course, new machine learning features. But that's all from me on this one. Like, subscribe, share if you enjoyed the content, and ring the bell for instant notifications for new Digital Foundry content. That's all from me for now, though. So thanks for watching and supporting Digital Foundry.